I know. I first met him maybe 15 years ago. It was one of those lunches with some economist from South America, had some ideas about solving poverty. I go to lunches like that because it bugs me that America's so rich. Well, most of the world is poor, and the world hasn't figured out a way to give them what it was that gave us the power to prosper. So I go to the lunch. I'm skeptical, but there sits Hernando de Soto of the Institute for Liberty and Democracy. It's a think tank based in Peru, and he starts pulling these pictures out of his briefcase. The pictures show slum dwellings built on top of each other, much like this. And De Soto went on to explain, well, I'll let you explain it. What do these pictures show?
These pictures show that roughly about 4 billion people in the world actually build their homes and own their businesses outside the legal system, so it's all haphazard and disorganized. But because of the lack of rule of law, the precision, the definition of who owns what, and because they don't have addresses, can't get the credit, can't get...
What do you mean they don't have addresses?
Well, to get an address, somebody's got to recognize that that's where you live. That means that there's legal recognition. Legal recognition means property. When you've got property, you know you've got mailing addresses, and when you make a deal with someone, you can be identified. At the end, the second characteristic of identity is your address. You go anywhere, they say, what's your name? And the second thing is, where do you live? Until property is defined by law, they can't get into the kind of deals or the division of labor, which is cooperation with other people to specialize and create wealth, because that's what makes you wealthy. The fact that you don't have to milk a cow every day, you don't have to work your land every day, you don't have to build your own house. You can stick to doing a TV program, or you can do this part of a BlackBerry, and the whole market puts it together. These guys can't. They've got to do their whole building, take care of it, and they can't specialize, and that's the reason of their poverty. The day that they get titled, the day that the businesses in their homes, the sewing machines, the cotton gins, whatever it is they've got there, the car repair shop, finally gets recognized, they can start expanding. They can start using scale.
But they need to be recognized by someone, local authority, who says, this is yours.
They need to work within the law.
Many of these places barely have law.
That's right.
So they take a risk. They just work a deal with the guy on the first floor, and they build their house on the second floor?
That's right. Probably the guy on the first floor who had the guts to squat and make a deal with someone from government who decided to look the other way has got an invisible property right. You know, it's not very different from when you Americans started going west, all the way to California. Like, for example, the California Gold Rush. The land didn't belong to them. Hey, the country didn't belong to them. It was Mexico. But you went in there, you put 800 mining claims association, 3 million Americans, big guns, and after a while you decided, why keep on shooting at each other? So between 1848, say 1856, and the beginning of the 20th century, you went out, created a private property system that brought in banks, and you created prosperity.
But California really got rich, and the rest of the world hasn't. What's the difference?
Because you Americans at that time were absolutely conscious of what the rule of law was about, and as people kept on moving from the East Coast to the West Coast, George Washington, your first president, called them banditti. You bandits don't have a right to be there. And Congress came around and said, oh, yes, they do. And you started awarding property on the basis of improvements.
We didn't always have deeds in America. Before deeds and rule of law, American settlers worked out their own generally accepted rights to property.
So in certain areas of the United States, they had tomahawk rights, which meant those areas where you shaved off part of a tree, probably somebody else shaved part of the same tree to indicate that they had accepted it. In some cases where they grew corn, for example, the corn grew from here to there, and that established a right from here to there. So those were actually called corn rights. It was an improvement on the land that gave you the title to it because you had worked it.
China is still developing such property rights.
But in much of the countryside, the past prevails, and the land is owned collectively.
The whole notion of property rights has been pretty alien to formerly socialist countries because right from the beginning, Marx said it. In the 19th century, property is theft.
But compare the countryside to cities like Shanghai.
I visited Shanghai about 30 years ago, and none of these buildings existed at that time. It's incredible what happens when you just change the rules of the game.
What should the rules of the game be?
The rules of the game have to say and recognize who really owns what. Because how you relate to the assets you have determines how you relate to your neighbor and the rest of the world. We work on paper and plastic, and if you don't have what you own on paper and plastic, you will not be recognized according to standard rules and you can't play the game.
This idea of a deed protecting property seems simple, but it's very powerful, allows all this commerce between total strangers that wouldn't happen otherwise. It applies to more than just skyscrapers and factories. We at Fox Business cover stock markets. De Soto taught me that they only work because of deed-like paperwork that we trust because we have rule of law.
What I'm trading today is roughly 1,000 futures contracts. That represents about 40,000 head of cattle. I never see this cattle. I actually have never been outside of Chicago to the west to see where these animals are.
In the United States and Western Europe, your documents go to the market and practically work for you and think for you. In developing countries and most of the former Soviet Union, the majority of people actually have to bring their animals to market. People in the developing world have cattle, land, and houses the same way they do in the Western world. What is missing is the rule of law.
And you say if they just had rule of law, they'd be as rich as we?
Oh yes, of course. But let me tell you, bringing in the rule of law is no easy thing. You're trying it now in Iraq, you ain't getting there. You're trying in Afghanistan, you're not getting there.
You started your work in Peru, trying to establish property rights there. You were an economic advisor to the president, and you reformed permit laws to the extent that other countries now invite you to go to, you've gone to Russia, Libya, you met with Gaddafi. 23 countries, Egypt, Honduras, Philippines. So the leaders of these countries, they must get that they're doing something wrong.
They get it easier than a North American because you see, the people who brought in the rule of law and property rights into the United States were in the 18th and 19th century. They were your great-great-great-great-granddaddies. You can't remember that. But in the case of these guys, they see that they're poor relative to your wealth. So it's easier for them to say, where's the difference? They're constantly looking for it, so they can recognize it much faster. What we didn't realize over time was that the fact that you could determine that a piece of land went from there to here, you could also do it with a movie script. And you could also do it with an idea, with an invention. And once that there was certainty after who owned what, all of a sudden we started seeing that people trusted the paper more than the object itself, because we found through law ways of standardizing it and recognizing it. And on top of that, you built a stock market and you built all that leveraging, which has got you into some kind of trouble now, but without which you wouldn't have gotten where you are today.
Property rights gave us the power to prosper. Thank you, Hernando de Soto.
Thank you, John.
We will be right back.